Hello, this is Professor Stephen Shwiff of the Columbia Gorge Community College discussing the background of the colonial American family and how these families were structured coming from a long history of European tradition. Now, most of Europe formed their family structure based on patriarchy, the leadership of a father and how the descent was traced from father to son and so forth, rather than from mother to child. And the problem here, and this problem will create much of the uncertainty and the strict laws governing women, their bodies, their rights, and much of their freedom will be that maternity is certain. You know whose child belongs to whose mother at birth, but you don't know who the father is. Could be any number of men that could be the father in a normal circumstance. Of course, today we have DNA, and that can trace exactly or pretty close to exactly who the father of any child is and what relationship people are together, but they didn't have that back then. All they could tell was if somebody looked like their father or who was the presumptive father. So we'll discuss how this creates a situation that is very dangerous and restricting for women, and also some other possibilities. Now here's the patrilineal system. All of the heritage, all of the genealogy traces down from the father, and that is the important relationship and judges the distribution of land, the inheritance of land, and titles and things like that. Now, matriarchy is a system that is certainly followed in many countries. Africa is usually, or most African countries follow the matriarchal line, and that is seen as the only safe conduit for family power, inheritance, and identity, because like I said, maternity is certain. And here's the matrilineal system, tracing the heritage from the mother on down through their generation. Now, also, the Native Americans were generally matrilineal, and this caused quite a great deal of consternation for the early founders and settlers of the New World, because strict religious doctrines had that men and women were not to have sex until they were married, and at that point you settled down with one spouse and the two of you were united sexually and as a family for the rest of your life and for really all eternity. The Native Americans, very much like the Africans and other matrilineal societies, don't worry about this tie between man and woman, because they don't have to worry about the connection with their children's and their inheritance. And so the Native Americans were very free with their women. Women had no set partner. Often they would have a serial monogamy, where they would be with a man for a certain amount of time. If they got tired of that man, or if they simply wanted to move on, they could easily. And so there was very much sexual freedom. There was the belief that the tribe and the people owned all of the land, and it was very free and open society. Would the Europeans come in and say the natives needed to be like Europeans, settle down with one woman, cover their bodies, and women would often go bare from the waist up and then have very little on the rest of their body. The men as well would be dressed in a similar fashion, and so the Europeans had a great deal of trouble with the matriarchal nature of Native American society, even if they understood it, which there's a good possibility that they simply thought the natives were savages and had no conception of what God really wanted for society and what was proper. Now, Native Americans also took on an active role in governing their tribes, and there's examples from the Iroquois who elected all male representatives, but the women voted for them, and so therefore the source of the power came from the women given to the men to represent them in councils, and implicitly the men needed to keep the women happy with their decisions, or they would be voted out and somebody else would replace them. Throughout the area of the initial contact, there were certainly male kings, but women also had a vital role in negotiations and in governing the native tribes. And you can see here women actively involved in Native American pursuits, trading, that sort of thing. And of course, the negotiations. And this was a real problem once again for the Europeans, that they demanded that the Native Americans send men to negotiate, when usually women would be the go-betweens for many of the tribes. And I'm generalizing, of course, and none of the generalizations are true of every tribe, but it was generally true that women exercised more power and had more freedom under the Native Americans system. Here, of course, is the famous depiction of Pocahontas saving John Smith, and we talked about that in the Jamestown lecture, but it's also relevant here that a powerful leader, Powhatan, would even give his daughter a minute's thought as far as what she wanted. And if the story was true, which there is some doubt, as discussed in that lecture, it certainly implies that women had more power than they would in Europe and in the New World. Now, the English, French, and Spanish women who came over to the New World all came from very different systems, but of course the English legal system will be the one that wins out. We'll talk about this in a subsequent lecture, that the leaders of the American Revolution, most of the colonies were very much from the English heritage, and there was no question that they were following English law. And in fact, we'll get to this in those lectures, but the English revolutionaries claimed their rights as English gentlemen, as English citizens, before they ever thought of breaking with the king and parliament. They thought of themselves as English, with those English rights that had been guaranteed from the fields of Runnymede at, when Magna Carta was signed, all the way down to their present day, the 1700s. Now this will show that the difference between English women and the other women is part of this restriction. Now we'll get to the rights of English colonial women in our next lecture, discussing the different areas, but the basic difference is here that Massachusetts Bay colony settled as communities, and women came over with the original settlers on the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and with the Puritans 10 years later with John Winthrop and his group. Meanwhile, the Chesapeake Bay was mainly men working with an idea to get rich quick or to make their fortune very quickly. It's really until 1619 that the colony, Jamestown colony, after being founded in 1607, brought in women as indentured servants and started to try and encourage more and more women. But the rough statistics are that men outnumbered women even into the 1650s or so, for at least 4 times, in some areas 10 times the men for each woman. And so this will create a society that will be hungry for wives, and will also give these wives some power in choosing their mates. Of course, we'll talk in just a second about their law as married women, the law of coverture. Now, indentured women were the most common way for women to travel over to the New World, to Virginia, and they were treated as servants. They were strictly controlled by their masters. There was laws against them having sexual relations with anyone. You can also imagine that there was some sexual manipulation by the masters, since they had absolute power over these women. And maybe it was very similar to how slaves will be treated all the way into the Civil War era and often past that. Now, widows were holders of the land that they and their husbands had controlled, but they weren't strictly owners. And often widows would be given a life estate in all of the property that was left over, or some kind of interest in it. But as soon as they remarried, their new spouse would get total control over property that they had in their previous marriage, or that they received from their fathers. And this law ties in with the law of coverture. This unites the man and the woman in marriage, giving them one legal body, and that legal body is the man's. And so the husband has almost exclusive power and responsibility over all of the wife's property, all of her earnings. If she goes out and gets a job separate from her husband, which was very unlikely during this time, she would have to turn over that money. He would have absolute control. And he did not need her permission. For the most part, women were just considered part of their husbands. And so they weren't given the right to sue or be sued. They weren't given the right to execute a will unless their husband consented or put it in their own will as well. And so unless there was some legal protection put in by a woman or her representatives before marriage, the husband would have total control. And of course this set women on a path of total subordinates and no power. Women weren't given the right to vote because it was assumed that a husband and wife voted together, and so the husband's vote counted. In fact, it's interesting, and we'll get to this when we get to the Revolution, but women weren't really considered traitors. They were considered whatever their husband decided. If he decided to be a loyalist and support the British, often the wife was cast alongside that. And you have testimony of these women who are deserted by their husbands. They go after the war to Canada or to England in order to escape American retribution. And these women are saying, no, I was a patriot all along. My husband was a loyalist, I'm a patriot. You have to give me a break. And legally, they did not have to give them a break, but most of the time they would consider the woman's testimony and what she had done. But the law of coverture will be the law of the land until the Revolution, when there are starting to be some developments in women's rights that will give them a little bit more power. But until even the 1840s and 50s, with women's marital property acts, for the most part, women will be treated as their husband's property, or as part of the husband's estate, them and their bodies. Now, marriage for the colonists was very important. It was an economic and social institution. It was seen as holding society together, and that the orderly families would create an orderly society. And for the most part, it was a social match. The community would usually have a say on who got married. Usually not a love match, although there are statistics that support that roughly half of the women who were married in Puritan New England during the colonial days were pregnant at the time of their marriage. And usually these marriages were forced upon both of the man and the woman in the marriage couple. And so you can assume there was some attraction at least, but maybe not a lifetime decision to spend the rest of your life together. But they would force the men and women who were pregnant to get married, have that marriage solemnized before a child was born, and that was considered acceptable, not ideal, because certainly premarital sex was not a Puritan idea. Now the Puritans, and we'll get into this more in the next lecture, were not prudes. They did not discount sex at all, but they believed sex was God's gift to married couples, and that it was not to be shared outside the marriage, either with a partner who's not your husband or wife, or between two unmarried couples. So you have marriage being very important and strictly governed by the English law. Now, singlehood was not natural, and this was not part of the regular order of things. If you weren't married by a certain time, certainly by your 20s during the colonial days, you were suspect, and either you were unmarriageable, dangerous, something like a thornback, or a spinster, somebody who nobody would want to marry, very plain and negative connotations. And so women who were not ever married were generally seen as outside of the normal order of society and the regular course of things. And here's a map of the New England's, of the English settlements, going from Massachusetts at the top and heading on down to what will eventually become Georgia, which is marked on here as Georgia by the 1760s.